Do you consider yourself a high achiever? Smart, driven, highly successful? I am so excited to have you. My name is Julia Arndt and I'm the host of the Stress Podcast. I will help you develop your stress resilience the same way you've developed your workplace superpowers. Learn peak performance tools to thrive at work and in your personal life. Let's get started. Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Stress Podcast. I am very excited to sit here today with our next podcast guest, and it is Eric Leffler. Hi Eric, how are you today?
Hey Julie, thank you so much for having me on today. I'm very excited about this.
Yeah, me too. Eric, I always start my podcast with 3 really simple questions. Number 1, where are you located? Number 2, what time is it? And number 3, what have you been up to up until sitting down for this podcast today?
These are the hard-hitting questions right off the bat, right?
The hard-hitting questions. We get right into it.
I believe it is shortly after 2:00 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So I'm in the New York area. I'm in a suburb right outside of New York in Connecticut. And what was your last question? See, you already knocked me off.
What have you been up to this morning?
Oh, well, it was a really, really good mix. One is completely irrelevant to our conversation today, and one is very, very relevant to the conversation today. But I actually had to make a new batch of my fresh homemade granola. So I got that out of the way. And then I've also been building a new workshop around the different types of roles and how we self-identify at the workplace, and some of the challenges that arise when we take on different roles and the expectations that come along with that. So that's something that I'm really excited to, to kind of delve into and to start sharing with more people. But I'm just in the first stages of really kind of working out the workshop. It's going to be called Know Your Role. And there's definitely going to be a GIF of Dwayne Johnson, aka The Rock, somewhere in it.
Nice, it's nice. I love it. And do you have any specific routines that you do every single morning besides preparing your granola, which I know you don't do every day? But yeah, how do you start your day?
With humility, I will say that the granola is that good that I probably should be making it every day because it goes by very quickly. But no, my days start. I think everybody needs to figure out what works best for them, right? And it's different for everyone. I typically wake up between 5 and 6 a.m. But it doesn't really matter. Weekends, weekdays, whatever else is going on. It's really important for me to journal every morning because I wake up with every thought rushing through my head. So it's really important for me to get rid of all of those thoughts and just to get all of the nonsense down. So I use the composite Mead black and white notebooks that I just have stacks of them that one day somebody will find all of them and not know what to do with all of these thoughts. So I make sure I clear my head. I make sure I read every morning too, right? Just to kind of nourish the brain a little bit. And then I make sure I move my body a little bit. So whether that's going for a run, doing some yoga or stretching, or, getting down to the gym. So I was able to knock all 3 of those off my to-do list this morning. So I'm feeling really, really good.
That's awesome. Super nice. Great. Eric, tell us a little bit more about what you do in your day-to-day. You already mentioned you are working on a new workshop. What do you do and how long have you been doing it and how did you get to do what you do today?
Yeah. Well, I'm a 16-year media vet. I've worked at CNN, MSNBC, and Conde Nast for brands like Vanity Fair and GQ, among some of the others. About 4 years ago, I started taking more of an invested interest in the actual process of leading, right? I think a lot of times people end up moving up and getting bumped up into leadership roles without having any sort of training or knowledge of the day-to-day. And I realized that as I started managing teams and more importantly, senior leaders. And we would discuss things like how to run meetings and setting expectations with your team and, kind of really navigating all of those tougher conversations that come up every day. And they would come back to me after being like, yep, cool, got it. We can do this totally. and being confused and asking very simply, like, so how do I set an expectation, right? And I realized then, I love Simon Sinek and starting with why, and we all know that. I like to start with how and what. What are we working with and how do we do it, right? Because I feel like that's where we get our hands dirty in this process. So I started taking an invested interest in really kind of breaking down a lot of the different steps towards managing teams and leading teams. And that eventually led me down to what I'm currently doing, right? Which is coaching, consulting. I consider myself an EQ leadership specialist. And my goal is to bring as much emotional equity and intelligence into the workplace. And there's a couple of different ways and approaches that I take to this, because much like everything else that we all experience in life, it's really about the individual's journey. So there's not a textbook, there's not a guide. I can't write the 15 things you need to know about leading a team through an emotional lens, because I've tried. And it changes. And there's so many contingencies and nuance, right? Because we're impacted by everything that's happened to our life. We're impacted by every step of the way. And I refer to them as workplace needs, right? Not dissimilar from Maslow's hierarchy of needs. When these needs are being met or dismissed throughout our career, having that one good mentor or that one good boss can send somebody down one road, or it can send them down another one. And so when we're looking at how managers are being developed and how people are showing up for themselves at work, not just other people, not just for their job and their employer, but how they're showing up for themselves, that really impacts a lot of what your workplace satisfaction is, what your engagement is, and what the experience is for everyone else around you. So this is where we start to come down into this, the questions around the emotional equation of what you're bringing into the office, what you're giving, and what you're taking.
And have you had the realization at some point doing all of this research around managing and leading teams and, the process of doing that it's all connected to emotional intelligence, or how did you make that decision? I think that's really interesting.
Yeah. So there's a terminology. It's not my terminology. It's used, widely used, but it's referred to as like knowing your parts, right? There's all different sorts of internal versions of who you are, right? There's an exercise I like to do with clients where we actually name your parts, right? So first we identify them and then we name them, and you can give them, it could be Eric, John, and Charlie. It could be the strawberry, the apple, the orange, right? For the way I like to think about it, and there's two ways of approaching the way we look at the world, right? There's a top-down approach and there's a bottom-up approach, right? So the top-down is the analytical, and like literally think about like starting with your head, your brain, your thoughts. And then it works down, and then you're experiencing emotions as almost like a secondary response system. Or there's the bottom up, which is the inverse of that. You're starting with your emotions, right? Those are the individuals that are less analytical, more emotional first. They react to something, they respond to something that's happening, and then they stop and they think like, okay, was that the right thing to do? What are the repercussions of it, right? And it's not one way or the other. It's very, very fluid, right? Everything is very fluid because we're talking about the emotions that our body's feeling without us even being aware of it. But I think there's a third part also, right? And that's your creative part. So you kind of have your analytical mind, you have your creative heart, and then you have your emotional guts almost, right? And I look at the creative heart as kind of the bridge between both worlds. And we're all creative people. We express that in different ways. And I love even just creative problem solving or creative solution finding is so important in the day-to-day when we're going to work, when we're in the workplace, when we're engaging with people, finding solutions on the fly. The more intuitively aligned you are, the better you're going to be able to navigate all of these challenges. And that's where I come into like triggers. right? I used to refer to like positive triggers and negative triggers, right? But I think the one thing that makes it that everyone has in common at work is that there's someone or something that bothers them, right? Like no one's going to work being like, everything is fine. It doesn't matter if you're the CEO or you're a brand new employee, you've been there for one day, right? There's something that's getting under your skin. And when that happens, you're getting triggered for some reason. You're having a reaction, right? So I try to move clients away from having reactions and to having responses. Responses are a more controlled state. But in the same sense, you're also having activations. So, you ever have somebody say something to you and you get so excited that you just like, you can't not jump in. And you're like, oh my God, yes, that. Joy and anger are very, very closely related, right? Shame and grief are, sister emotions, sister feelings. When we're talking about the activations and the triggers, we really have to come back to just starting with having an awareness of what we're feeling. So like one of my homework assignments that I will give clients is like, okay, so when you're feeling, after we identify their emotions, and I have all these as free resources on my website, ericleffler.com, just identifying which emotions you feel the most often at work and having that written down somewhere, right? Or like doing it on a Post-it and taping it to the side of your computer is a great way of just being more aware of them in the moment. Then you start to feel the different kind of fight, flight, fawn, freeze reactions to all of these emotions that you're feeling throughout the day. And then you can start to see the patterns. Why is this happening here? Why is this happening here? There's no bad emotions. There's no good emotions. These are the things that you feel. And this is kind of where you default to. But when we start to get that awareness, then we can start to come back to our bodies, regulate them a little bit. So everyone's not getting all amped up at the office and it's not competitive because we're all dealing with ego and prestige needs, right? This desire to be recognized. But with that also, you have the reprimand. It's two sides of the same coin. So an analogy that I like to use is, and hopefully, our listeners here haven't experienced this, but some probably have, where you're getting called in to your boss's office or you're joining them for a last minute Zoom. And then suddenly the HR rep is sitting in the room with them, right? Or they show up on the Zoom. And we've all been trained and everyone's thinking right now, like, oh, you're getting fired. This is not a good conversation. HR is never there. And I know plenty of people in HR, right? They hate this reputation that they're always the bad news bringer. But you really don't know what's going to happen. But we're still moving into that emotional state. For all you know, your boss may be leaving the company and you may be getting tapped to take over their job. You may be getting a promotion. It may just be new policy to roll out bonuses or merit increases or any of these types of things. Playing with these emotions and just understanding how our body is processing everything without jumping to assumptions, it helps us move into a state where we're never truly broken. We're just getting bruised a little bit, right? And that helps us get through our days.
Yeah, super fascinating topic. Emotional intelligence is something that it's actually also part of my program, of the Peak Performance Method program. I have kind of like this 9-step program to sustaining performance. And I actually believe that emotional intelligence is a really important part of it and brings all of the different parts that I'm trying to teach people together into more of a leadership role. And, I think one of the biggest questions that I have, and I think that a lot of people always have, is that question around leading, right? So emotional intelligence consists of 4 parts, right? We have the self-awareness and self-regulation. And then the more we master that, right, the more we understand ourselves, the more we know how we respond and react to certain situations. And the more we know how to regulate that, the more we can now start to see that in other people as well, right? And start to have that awareness for other people and be able to lead them. My question is, how? How, once you recognize that, right? Once you see people have these emotional reactions and are not as aware as we are about their behaviors, how, as a good leader, can you help them become more emotionally versatile, I would say, and probably also that creative heart leader that you mentioned at the beginning?
Yeah. There's probably like 1,000-word essay, and then there's like a 2-word essay I can give on this. But I think that from a leadership perspective, well, there's a couple of things, and these are like nice little bumper stickers, right? People want to be seen, heard, and understood. People want clear, concise communication. And we need to normalize vulnerability, right? We have to debunk the perfectionist myth. It is one of my core workplace needs that I talk about is the need for safety. Now, again, coming back into our bodies, we're wired like a bear isn't going to burst into your office and start rampaging the way it would in a village, tens of thousands of years ago. I'm not an anthropologist, so I don't know when the whole caveman thing was happening, right? But it doesn't mean that we're still not having our fear-based instincts activated. And so when I'm talking about safety, I'm talking about emotional and intellectual safety. Because as much as we want to say, like, don't bring your work home with you, right? Which we all know happens. The modern day workforce is bringing their home with them to work. We expect our companies to care about us. We expect them to care about, all these causes that are going on, from global warming to, racial equity, all the D&I initiatives. And they're all really, really important for companies to take a stand on these issues. But I'm not talking about those larger pictures, right? I'm talking about what the individual can do, right? So they're looking to have these needs met from their boss. And then the manager side, the manager needs to be open and willing to kind of receive that. So the intellectual for me is, do you feel safe speaking up in a meeting? If you have an idea, are you bringing it to the forefront? Are you willing to challenge even your boss on something that is happening throughout the day, right? And can you do that in an environment where your boss is not going to shut you down right away, right? The whole no is such a triggering experience for so many people. And the emotional safety is like, okay, like there would be days where I'd be managing my team and I would just from the side be like, team, today's a rough day, just trying to get by. That's where I'm at. Okay. Everybody knew where I was coming from. And then the next day they're like, how are you feeling today? I'm like, I'm good. And then they would hit me with all the hard hitting, like fire drills and, and putting out everything. Creating a space where people can just kind of level check where they're feeling and how they're able to move through the day. And some people are really, really comfortable with that, sometimes too much so, sometimes not enough. And as a manager, we're kind of trained to just be, especially when the higher up you go, you're just looking at the numbers. So you're like, okay, Julie's not performing the way that she used to. Something must be up. Do we need to put her on a performance plan? Does HR need to get involved? Has her direct manager spoken to her, right? Or she's got something happening in her life that is just impacting her for this little time, but Julia doesn't feel safe talking to her manager about what's really going on. And they don't need all the details. They just need to know, like, hey, I'm working through this. I'm good to show up for work, but I'm just not feeling my full self right now. And we need to be able to meet that with compassion.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I think it hasn't even just something to do with feeling safe to say it. A lot of the things that I've heard as well is that people are just not used to saying it, right? Because in their families, they just didn't express needs and feelings and emotions and thoughts the way someone else might have been used to expressing it. And that was a really big learning for me too. It was actually, you know, I think it has like a lot to do with like culture and diversity as well, of like, are we used to expressing that? Are we not used to expressing that? Are we used to being vulnerable? Have we seen that from our parents? How do you have these conversations with the people that are not that are uncomfortable, not aware, and sorry, that are uncomfortable, not aware, and yeah, and just in a difficult situation?
Yeah. I'm going to answer that question in two ways, right?
Mhm.
Because I think, first of all, I think any of us working in this space, right? Like start young. So I have an 11-year-old son. And
Mhm.
when I see him acting one way, I'm like, oh, we talk about our feelings. He
Mhm.
might look back and be like, that was amazing. Or it might be the most annoying thing that he goes through, right? But like the other day, I got to explain to him what anxiety is.
Mhm.
And he was feeling anxious, right?
Mhm.
But he didn't have the word. So just having the word to be able to put to a feeling is such a powerful thing,
Mhm. Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And I mean, and we've all heard, now this is my second way of answering your question, right? The like you can't help someone who doesn't want to be helped. You can't change anybody, even if they want to be changed, right? These are internal
Mhm.
things that you need to do.
Mhm.
I've found that one of the most powerful ways to connect, right? A really, really great bid for connection at the workplace is when you're interacting with someone, it's not just saying, hey, what's up? What's going on? Like the common nomenclature that like isn't a real call and response. You're sitting down with somebody. How are you doing? And yes, play with the words a little bit, stress different parts of it.
Mhm.
I've had people tell me just by asking that question, they may not have opened up to me, but it allowed them to take a deep breath because somebody cared enough to ask how they were doing.
Mhm.
And we're just simply not. A way that I describe this is that like our world is fully digital, but our bodies are still analog.
Mhm.
Our computers, our cell phones, everything operates so quickly, right? This whole entire conversation could be generated by AI right now,
Mhm.
but it's not. We're two people. We're talking to each other. We need to process things. We're not trying to rush through it. We're having a conversation. And it's giving people some of that space. And now there's one big thing that like we're kind of dancing around because the emotional equation and then the results driven nature of our workforces is constantly going to be in conflict, right? That's the work that I'm trying to do, is the more leaders we can get aligned with this, your engagement's
Mhm.
going up and, you're like, it's everyone's on the bus for the right reasons, right? Going back to like the good to, from good to great quote. The we need to be able to pivot these conversations in a way that just lowers the temperature just a little bit, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
To bring some of the stress down from everyone around us, right? And also, as leaders, admitting when we mess something up or when it's on us.
Mhm.
I always say when people, in some of the consulting, when people are like, what is the first thing I need to do? Right. And if you're a leader and if you're in a new role and you're the whole thing, I'm like, get a
Mhm.
really good number two,
Mhm.
right? Have somebody that can be a mirror to you. And by
Mhm.
that, I mean, not mirror your actions, but the more common way of putting it is like someone to keep you in line.
Mhm.
Someone that if you're self-reflecting and you feel like you're stepping out, you can be like, hey, am I in the right here? Or am I right? And the problem is that most people, when they get into these leadership roles, even when you're making a suggestion, and it's a good-willed suggestion, right? It's coming off as an order, because that's the perception of the rest of the team.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you're walking around, you're looking at paint samples, right? And you're like, they're thinking green. You're like, did you guys think of blue? That wall's going to be blue so fast,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Having a team that's going to challenge you, or at least an inner circle that's going to be able to push back and be like, they need more time for that. Or maybe just let them run with it and see what they come up with, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's creating a more of an open flow, right? With the way that we're all interacting and working with each other.
Mm-hmm. And you already answered a really important question that I was just writing down as you were speaking, which was, should these higher up leaders that are just looking at the numbers because maybe they don't feel like they have enough time anymore to really look at the people, care about developing emotional intelligence?
Yeah. The number one thing I hear from the higher executives, right, is that it's so lonely on the top.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that from everyone else at the company, they're like, oh, woe is them, right? Like, who cares? You're getting paid, you have the job, like, you don't really care about a thing, right? It kind of goes back to what I was just saying, right? Open the doors. Don't run away from the hard conversations. Be consistent with your communication. It is harder, right? Because as your, C-suite presidents, they're in a place where they have done all these things to get to that place. Whether they were right or wrong, they have the belief that, well, it got me here, it's going to get me there, right? And it's hard to take a step back, and it's hard to change ways and change behaviors and change habits, right? And that's kind of the way I approach my work, is based on making these intangibles slightly more tangible for individuals. Right. So if you're telling me, and this comes into something I call like rewriting your narrative. So you have a perception of yourself, and then there's other perceptions of you, right? And then you have a perception of where you want to be. So we're dealing with three things, but there's basically two polar opposites. And it's going to sound way simpler than it is, but like, try to do it yourself. Literally write everything down, and then rewrite it, all these narratives that you've created about yourself, to reflect the version of you that you want to be. And once you do that, then it comes down to what decisions that you're making to get there, right? So it's a little bit of like a manifestation, right? But what we're really talking about is an identity shift. It's a role shift. And how that interacts, and what state of fluidity you have, between that. I talk a lot about workplace values, and it was a couple of years ago that I did first, like, my life values, and everyone does the same thing, right? It's like 50 values, and you narrow it down to 10, and then you think about it and you really reflect on it. You narrow it down to like 2 or 3, and you have to do the same thing for the workplace. Now, they might mirror your life values, and they might be completely different. And I also have I have a list up on my website, also under my free resources tab, just if anybody wants to jump in and kind of explore this on their own. For me, values becomes an indicator for the decision-making process. So when I'm working with clients and they're telling me that they had to make a decision, but they kind of felt, they felt gross about it. They didn't feel like it was like completely aligned with who they are, but they couldn't really put their finger on it, right? For me, that's present state versus future state, right? But if they don't know what their values are, if they haven't pinpointed, if they haven't, like we were talking about the emotions, right? If they haven't pinpointed and put a word to what their value is, they have no North Star. And that's something that all of these workplaces are struggling with, right? It's clearly defined North Stars and values. I've never seen anything that was clearly defined as like, these are our company values that were like true reflections that people could really embody in their day-to-day. So what can we do? We can only control ourselves. So let's figure out our own workplace values. So then you make a decision and now you have awareness, right? And you're like, well, I felt really good about the decision. Okay, now I'm going to go back and look at my values. These are my 3 values. Oh, yep. That aligns with growth. That aligns with curiosity. That aligns with critical thinking. I understand why that decision I felt really good about. This other decision I did not feel good about. I'm going to look at my values. Oh, it doesn't align with any of them? Well, why did I make that decision? Right? So first it's a reflection, but then as they're working through and actively practicing this in their day-to-day, week after week, they start to make more decisions that align closer with their values. And when the decisions are aligning with their values, they start to become the leader that they've always wanted to be. It all stacks. It all starts to come together.
Yeah. What do you think are the biggest constraints for people to actually develop those skills? Is it time? Is it the willingness or like the awareness? Or like, what are the objections that you hear from people when you tell them, well, you know, maybe it would be good to develop XYZ skill?
Yeah. So time is definitely a factor, but the time is going to be different for everyone. And I also think it depends on like if you're top down or bottom up processing the information, right? Because some people can think about it real quick and apply it, but they're not really learning the lesson, right? Again, flip the results if you're coming in the other way. I think that we've talked about awareness, but I think acceptance is a really big part of it, right? So if you have a reputation for not being a great communicator, right? There's a part of you that maybe just needs to accept the fact that you're not a great communicator, right? If this has been haunting you for 25 years and you're the only person in your personal history that thinks that you are, the next great orator of, of their generation, something's not aligned. Honestly, like as a coach, I'm usually not touching that, right? Because that's their perception, and me telling them, well, everyone else is saying this. It's the same thing when you're doing 360 reviews of individuals, right? You can just present the information. But what we can do is start to find tangible steps that they can take every day to improve their communication, right? And then eventually it comes back around and they're like, the most gratifying moments I have is when someone says like, I didn't really think I wasn't a good communicator, but then over the past 3 weeks, I noticed that I wasn't, but now I'm getting much better at it, right? A lot of it's just meeting people where they are, right? It's the same thing you were asking about the manager, the leader, and how you're working with your teams that may not have the vocabulary. You take it day by day, and if you accept the brutal truths of your own identity and you start to let go of that feeling, right? I always say like, and if you're watching this, you can see my hands, but if you're holding something palm down, you have to grasp it to hold on to it. If you flip it up, it can rest loosely in your palm and it's not going anywhere, right? So you still have it, but you can also let go of it a little bit. Where if you're grasping it, the minute you let go, you lose it. So we want to be in a place where we can freely let go of things instead of grasping on to, these desires that we have, right? To be a great speaker. Maybe you don't need to be a great speaker. Maybe you just need to be a little bit greater, a little bit better at communicating to your team, and then everything else will start to align, right? So.
Yeah, that's a really good tip. How did you make the decision to take that leap from your 16-year media experience to actually becoming a coach and consultant? What was that internal drive for you?
I will give you, I'll predate my career and I'll go back into college, which I learned while I was picking a major, which is just my personal preference, the way my mind operates. I'm much better at identifying what I don't want to do than what I do want to do. I personally believe that leaves me open to a lot more possibilities and opportunities. But at every stage of my career, I've been in these moments where I was on the precipice of the thing that I wanted. And I kind of had that out of body experience where I was like, oh, wait, I'm not feeling it anymore. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And there's another adventure. There's something new for me to embark on. And that has kind of guided me all the way up until this transition.
Mm-hmm.
And this is actually more of a conscious choice because of the work that I did in my last corporate run, where I was so closely working and helping individuals learn how to be better leaders, better managers, and seeing people that legitimately wanted to so desperately do good by their teams and were just struggling for answers. And maybe I'm stubborn, but I just feel like that going to work does not have to be a zero-sum game and that there can be a different way. And, I just want to be a part of this group, right, that we're in, of helping people, lower the temperature a little bit and bring a little bit more empathy to the workplace.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I see this as such important work. So I'm really glad that you're doing this. And I'm sure you have plenty of work in the New York area with all of the businesses and that are out there. And yeah, and just I have always believed that if everyone would have just a little bit more empathy and emotional intelligence, the workplace would be such a more enjoyable place to be.
I agree. And I worked with a great attachment coach about a year ago. And at the end of all of our sessions, she would say, be kind to yourself. So, and I think that's just a really great kind of, we can bring a little bit more kindness to everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. How have you seen the tech layoffs impact your work and also just the awareness of the importance of emotional intelligence?
Yeah, it's I think what ends up happening, and I think that this started happening with younger millennials also, right? That balance where I said earlier, right, where we take our work home with us, but we also bring our work ourselves into work.
Mm-hmm.
Technology has made it easier for us to blend all of our identities together, right? So there's these like amorphous blobs now, and it's not clearly defined. And things like purpose, meaning, why are you getting up every day? You start to border on all the existential questions. And if our work role and our workplace identity is so strong and we end up losing that, how are all of the other identities that you have in your life supporting you during that time? How are you transitioning so you don't lose yourself in that? And it's that's a part of the work that I do. And my advice to anybody kind of going through this, because there's a lot, right? It's the tech layoffs, it's the media layoffs. And it's hard because, a lot of these trends are going to be sticking, not necessarily the layoffs, but there's not a lot of growth happening right now in these sectors, throughout the rest of the year, really, perhaps in Q3 or Q4 as people are ramping up for the new year. And I think it's a really good moment of reflection on how are you building up community and building up these different identities that you have to support yourself while you move forward. Spend some time tapping into those different parts, the analytical mind, the creative heart, the emotional gut, right? And get in better touch with yourself. I think it's not necessarily the event that's happened, it's about what happens next. And I encourage everyone to take some time to just kind of reflect on, whatever the next thing that comes for them, which will be great. to just be ready to kick ass at it.
Yeah, so powerful. I love that. That's a good last word for the podcast interview today, I think. Eric, if people are curious to learn more about the work that you do, how can they best connect with you?
Yep. So anyone can reach out to me at info@ericleffler.com. But directing traffic towards my website is a great way to, like I mentioned a few times, I have some free resources up there. My Calendly is up there, so you can book an appointment with me just to kind of talk a little bit more about anything that you're going through, with links to all my social and my newsletter. So ericleffler.com is the place to be in that regard.
Awesome. Great. Thank you so much. I'll make sure to obviously leave all of these insights in the show notes as well, so people have easy access to it. And if you have been listening to this podcast episode today and you feel like you know someone that would really benefit from the information that we shared today, please make sure to share this podcast episode with them. This is one really easy and simple way how you can help others, and also how you can support Eric and me in just spreading the word and making sure that these important insights are being heard. So thank you so much in advance already for doing that. And Eric, thank you so much for your time and for your patience today, because we had a little bit of technical issues during the podcast recording. But this is life, and we're still sitting here and we're still smiling at each other. So I think it was a great podcast episode overall. So thank you so much.
It was a great conversation. Thank you so much for having me, Julia.